Today's guest is someone whose name might not always be front and center, but whose work sits right in the heart of modern music history. Stuart Epps is a producer, engineer, and mixer who's worked with artists who helped define entire eras, including Elton John, Led Zeppelin, and Chris Rea. Stuart was part of Elton John's classic period, working closely with him in the studio at a time when the songs, the sound, and the ambition were all lining up. He wasn't just capturing performances, he was helping shape records that would go on to become part of the cultural fabric. And he was also there for one of those moments that feels almost unreal now, Elton John's legendary Madison Square Garden show in 1974, where John Lennon made his final live stage appearance. In this conversation, we talk about those sessions, the atmosphere in the studio, and what it was really like being in the room when music history was being made. And right at the end of the interview, Stuart also talks about how he works with new and emerging artists today, what he looks for, how collaboration works, and how you can work with him. Stuart Epps, first of all, welcome. I mean, this is a pleasure because it's rare that you talk to someone who has been there and been part of creating history and the history of music, particularly when it comes to someone like Elton John, where I was, a massive fan. It was my time of growing up. And I was absolutely mad about Elton and Bernie's lyrics and all that music and all those albums, particularly like the first wave of albums. There seemed to be so many in a very short period. But first of all, I want to start with you and your past, because a lot of things always start in the childhood and they get inspired through the childhood. So what sort of music and creativity were you brought up around?
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you for having me on this program. Nice to meet you. It is a good question because it wasn't a completely normal upbringing, I must admit, because my father, great guy, was very into sound, it turns out. And it's a good story because when I was only about 6 or 7, we're talking about the 50s, he sat me down in front of the TV, and I didn't know what was going on, but it turns out they were the first broadcasts of stereo. So you had one half of the stereo on the TV and you had the other half of the stereo on the radio. And they were sort of doing like a table tennis thing with ping pong, and it was going left to right. And I just, I was mesmerized. I was only a kid, but I was always into music anyway from an early age, playing guitar when I was 5 or 6. And the next thing that happens is my dad's bought a stereo radiogram, we used to call them in those days. And he had the very first stereo record, which was Journey into Stereophonic Sound on the Decca label. And he had these 10-inch speakers either side of the lounge. And next minute, we've got racing cars roaring around the room and orchestras playing and people knocking on the door saying, "Can you turn that noise down?" So this was the upbringing. And then my father brought home a tape recorder, which it was amazing that he let me mess with it, really. And so I discovered recording. And these are still, I'm still only about 10 or 11. And fascinated by what you could do, recording your voice or recording a guitar and then you play it back. So this is very early days that I got into recording and music.
I mean, what's interesting is, if you say you were a kid of the 50s, that this term teenager, although it was really coined I think it was in like the 1920s that it first came up, but it really came into sort of popular use in the 50s. And the 50s to the 60s were a massive period of change musically. So if you were a kid in that era, you were living through the first wave of really, I think, modern popular culture. How exciting was that period to be a kid at that time?
Well, it's, this is what continues in my talking to you, really, is that when you talk about excitement, you only realize just how exciting it was when you look back on the years, because otherwise you're just taking it for granted. So I almost took it for granted that I was offered to join a band and I'm singing in a band and we're doing clubs and this sort of thing. And I'm playing the guitar and we're hearing Cliff Richard on the radio. And we've got this record player at home, as I'm saying. And then, you know, most importantly to people of my age, is we were listening on what was called the radio, which I know that you'll know, but not everyone does. And in particular, we were listening to a radio station called Radio Luxembourg, which was way out, you know, in Europe somewhere. So you got this terrible crackly sound of these magnificent records that were being released in America with Elvis Presley, you know, Little Richard and all these great music of the 50s. But you were hearing it down this crackly radio system, which sometimes would just fade out. And actually, this gave me it gave me and other people this magic atmosphere of receiving music like this that would you had to really listen, and then it's there, and then suddenly it fades out and you wished you could have heard it perfectly, you know. So all these things, when you get older, you suddenly realize that they must have had a bearing for me on my interest in recording music, producing music and stuff.
I mean, it was a period of massive social change, and if you sort of compare it to today, most young people's parents listen to music that a lot of young people now discover. So, and this was very different. This was a sort of defining era. It's like when rap came up and it made some people old. Do you know what I mean? It was a defining era in a way. How did you take that in that era? Was it something that was, you know, you said there was an excitement when you look back, but did it install in you an idea that you could do anything?
Well, I guess it did. I mean, it's just in there, you know, you're taking in this information. I hear about people like Phil Collins that went to see the Beatles film and he's just sitting there and suddenly realizes that's what I want to do, you know. So, yeah, of course, these things come into your head, but whether you do anything with them and whether they develop into anything is another thing. And for me, being in bands and being into music, and then I used to record music with my mates on a Revox tape recorder at a very early age, you know, but we were just having fun. But then I was still very young at age 15. I got offered a job to go and work for the Dick James organization. And Dick James at that time happened to be the Beatles music publisher. And I'm still only 15, you see. So now I'm actually in the music business, admittedly as an office boy, but everything to happen for me very young, you know, at a very young age, which was great, you know, but amazing start, really. Now I'm in New Oxford Street, Dick James Music, and we're going on now. A guy came into the office one day dressed in a noddy shirt, all these great characters, and this one character was called Reginald Kenneth Dwight, a crazy name, and as we know, he changed his name to Elton John. But he was one of many sort of musicians that were around Dick James at that time, 1967 we're talking about, with Bernie Taupin, but with great musicians, Caleb Quay and Hookfoot and all these great people.
I mean, before we get to Elton or Reg, I mean, there's luck and there's opportunity and there's people that take the opportunity. At 15, it's, in a sense, it's a big step. Were your parents supportive?
Well, you're asking great questions here. I'm very happy to answer them, because as far as I was concerned, I figured that myself and my parents wanted me to stay on at school till I was 18. And you know, this worried me. And also the whole thing is that my big mate, Clive Franks, who became Elton's sound engineer, was already started working for Dick James in 1966. And he used to come home with all these stories, you know, we were mates about visiting Paul McCartney's house. And I just thought, this is for me, you know, this life sounds incredible. And to be honest, I was bored at school. I was only interested in music. So I was nervous, but I went to my dad and I said, look, I'm not happy at school. There's a possibility I might be able to get this job. Is that okay? And he just said, all right, you know, and I was like, knocked out, you know, that he'd accepted that I could leave school. So I couldn't wait to get this interview up at Dick James and got the job and started. And that was when I was 14, so I couldn't leave school till I was 15. And but I was very lucky that he allowed me to do that, as you say.
I mean, when you go into an organization as a T-boy, or or a runner, or whatever you want to call it, you get the opportunity to glean information from everyone. I mean, that's your big opportunity. Some people take it and some people don't. So how did you sort of go from being T-boy to your first step, in essence, of being in the studio, I presume, as like I'm going to call it engineer. I don't know if it's a junior engineer, but essentially in a real job?
Well, that's another good question. And at Dick James, it was a big organization, really. It wasn't obviously like EMI or one of the big ones, but still, but there were 40 people working there. We had a demo studio that I wasn't allowed in. I mean, the demo studio, even though it was a demo studio, it was like it was like a special place. So, but the hierarchy there was, you started off as office boy. Hopefully you did well there, and you got then elevated to disc cutter, which was a pretty amazing job, to be honest.
What does it mean?
Well, a disc cutter obviously is cutting discs like they do now with vinyl, but you see, we're talking about very early technology. So if a band, say Elton, has been recording demos in the studio, obviously he wants to take it home. So we used to have a cutting machine, and we would cut acetates, they were called, 45-inch acetates, so that the artist could take them home, play them on his record player without getting them pressed and all the whole rest of it. I mean, he or she might want to take a tape copy. So I used to do that. So this was a very responsible job that I was then in for about a year. I did this. And also it was an incredible place, because people used to congregate there. The bands of the time, Elton included, would congregate in this room. It was the first place where we were given, because we're talking about the Beatles music publisher here. So he was given copies of the Beatles albums before they were released. And it was an amazing thing. We were actually given the White Album, that incredible Beatles album. We were given the first copies of it. And I remember being in that room, and everyone, rang round everyone, you got to come and listen to this Beatles album. So it was a great job, really, this disc cutter and being in the tape copying room. So then after a year or two of that, then it probably only was about a year, maybe it was less, you were then elevated to assistant engineer. So that was going literally next door into this demo room. But as I say, we had the Trogs in there, we had Elton in there, Paul McCartney popped in. So it was a magnificent place to be, even though I was only the assistant engineer. Moving on from that, I then became the engineer. But during this time, sorry, I'm waffling on, hope you don't mind. During this time, I met, as we're saying, Reg Dwight, who changed his name to Elton John. And when he played me, he'd play a couple of songs at the piano. I just thought, wow, this is special. I immediately recognized, even though I was still only 16 or something, I thought this is something special. And so I started talking to other people, specifically a guy called Steve Brown, who was now in the offices, in A&R, about really, I wanted to get on to the music business side, not so much the engineering. I kind of wanted to get into this career of this guy Elton, to be honest, and see if I can help, how I can help out.
You mentioned the Beatles, and when I talked to Kevin Godley of 10cc, he mentions that when he was at school and the Sgt. Pepper album came out, it was like the world ended in one day. It was like, something so huge happened that the whole school stopped. Music had, and I don't know whether it's because I'm older as well, that music had seemed to have a bigger relevance and meaning in our lives at that point, and it was so much more powerful. Was it like that, do you think?
Well, Sgt. Pepper, when Sgt. Pepper was released, I hadn't started working for Dick James yet. But my friend Clive was already there. So he said, right, I've just had to take this record sleeve to the printers, and he's describing, because obviously he didn't have a copy of it, he's describing the Sgt. Pepper sleeve. And just, you know, obviously, so we're waiting for this album to come out. And of course, when it came out, it was a total landmark. You know, I love the Beatles up to then anyway, and we used to, you know, hang on their every note from all the early albums, from Rubber Soul to Please Please Me, you know, all those early albums. But things happen very fast in those days. You don't realize until you look back. So there were certainly not many years of the Beatles before Sgt. Pepper. And of course, technology as well, you know, and because I picked up on this, my ears were used to sort of hearing sounds. You know, I was always interested, as my friends were. And when you listen to a Beatles album, you weren't just listening to new songs and new beats or whatever, but you were hearing new technology. You know, you were hearing sounds that you'd never heard before that they created at Abbey Road. And it was definitely the same with the White Album. You know, if everyone remembers While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which I guess at the time, you know, we're sitting there with Elton there and all the musicians, and that guitar solo comes in, and you think, what is that? You know, you've never heard a guitar sound like that. Of course, it was only in later years we found out that it wasn't George Harrison. It was, in fact, Eric Clapton playing. But it didn't matter, really. As I say, you're quite right. You know, albums in those days had more of an impact, certainly on us being in the music industry and being musicians, you know, and also with Jimi Hendrix. You know, we remember these albums. I mean, unfortunately, the youngsters of today, when they get into an artist, which they often do from the past that we were into, they don't really hear the albums. You know, they might hear a compilation or they might hear individual tracks. But in those days, and I'm sure that you had that experience as well, we used to grow up with the artist, you know, certainly with the Beatles, but the same with Jimi Hendrix, who I loved, and Paul Simon, and then later on, you know, with James Taylor. Every single album, you heard the album just after it was made. So you used to grow up with the artists, getting to know them, rather than, you know, hearing bits from different eras of that particular artist, which was so exciting, as you say.
It's interesting you say growing up with the artists, because with Elton, you grew up sort of alongside a growing artist. I mean, he went from Reg Dwight to Elton John, obviously. And I mean, he was, in a sense, a sort of jobbing musician for a long time, playing in other bands, and his success took a long time. I mean, the first album, Empty Sky, there's a huge difference between Empty Sky and then the eponymous Elton John album.
Very good. You're obviously a fan, or you've been reading up on it recently. I mean, I can talk for hours on that subject. So
I love it. So go for it.
We haven't got hours. But the thing is that, see, when I met Reg, you know, he wasn't a singer and he wasn't an artist. He was a songwriter. So he was actually making songs for Lulu, for the Eurovision Song Contest. At the same time, because he was a great pianist and he'd learned the piano, he was, like you say, a jobbing session musician, I would call him. And he was doing 3 sessions a day, you know, 3-hour sessions, making good money, going all around the studios, doing very well, to be honest, and learning his craft. You see, at the same time, he was in a band. He was in Long John Baldry's band as the keyboard player. But as soon as he started doing sessions, he really wasn't playing live at all, you know. And so, like you say, we did grow up together. And then a guy called Steve Brown, because actually Elton made an album prior to Empty Sky, and a guy called Steve Brown came in, and I was in the disc cutting room looking after that, and we sat the Steve Brown down, who had been, you know, is now working for Dick James, and we played him this album that prior to Empty Sky, and he didn't like it. You know, he thought it was very poppy, it was very, I don't know, he just thought we thought it was brilliant. He'd made it with Caleb Quay, but he didn't. And what he said to Elton was, he said, have you got any other, you know, more meaningful lyrics maybe with Bernie? And have you got, because actually this was only when he just met Bernie. It culminated in Steve producing Elton John's first album, Empty Sky. And this was the start, really, of Elton John as an artist. And it was certainly the start of anything serious. And that was when I started working more in the A&R department, trying to, promote Elton, and Empty Sky was the start of it. And if you allow me to carry on, which is very good of you, because actually Steve, when it came to making Elton's next album, decided that he wasn't doing the best job, that he ought to find someone better. And Elton, in the meantime, had written all these amazing songs, Your Song of which was one of them. But the other songs were almost semi-classical. He used to play them on the piano, and he used to do demos in the studio. I used to do some of those piano and voice demos, which were magnificent, to be honest. They were totally unique to anything I'd heard, And anyway, he came into contact with Paul Buckmaster, the arranger, and then to Gus Dudgeon, the producer, and now Gus is on the scene. And he totally changed. As you pointed out, the difference between Empty Sky and the Elton John album are chalk and cheese, or night and day, So they are incredibly well produced. They're immaculate productions. They were done at Trident Studios. And now we had DJM Records, and I was assistant to the head of DJM. And I was everything to do with making that album, booking session musicians, booking the studio, Trident Studios. And this was incredibly exciting, to be honest, because we'd never heard. Gus transformed Elton sound, and anyway, they were amazing sounds, in a similar way to Sgt. Pepper, I suppose, but obviously very different music. But you'd go into a hi-fi shop and they'd be using this Elton John album to play to customers through their latest hi-fi, because it really was a magnificent sounding album. And this was the start, really. It was the start of Elton John as an artist. I'm now helping to promote him. We had logos, we took out advertising, this sort of thing. And they were very exciting times. I suppose we're talking about 1971, something like that, 71.
You mentioned Buckmaster, and he worked with Bowie on Space Oddity, which probably was the sound at that period that, you and Elton and Steve Brown would have been looking to. And that probably was the reason, because it was something so original, to go there. But was Elton a person, even at that point, that was looking around at all different music? Because he's one of the most interested people in music, isn't he? With his massive collection of records. He's always interested in new artists, even today. And he's obviously very aware of what's going on.
Another good question. Well done. Because I wouldn't have come up with this, but you see, in the disc cutting room, Caleb Quay, who was actually Elton's original record producer, the most amazing guitarist, a crazy guy, and the leader of a band called Hookfoot. So him and Elton used to go down to the record shop, Musicland in Soho, and they used to get the latest American imports. They might be singles, they might be albums. They were such incredible fans of music, but of new music, what was going on in America mainly, to be honest. And they bring them back to the disc cutting room, and we put them on. I can't remember them now, but there was a lot of, black soul artists and this sort of thing. You'll know them, but I can't think of them offhand. But you're absolutely right. You see, Elton, far beyond being a musician, to be honest, or songwriter, was a fan of music and still is. He lived and breathed music as a kid, what's coming down the radio, as I was saying, or then what he would pick up in Musicland. In fact, he used to work in this record shop. He just couldn't wait to get closer and closer to making music himself. But for the time being, in those early days, he just wanted to soak it all in, and go to gigs and hear what was coming out of America. So you're absolutely right about what you're saying there.
Did he have the focus on being a world star?
Not at all. And I won't say it again. Another good question. Because, Elton never thought of being a singer even. It was only when he was writing these songs in the early days, and then people were saying, you know, because I used to play, I was in A&R, so I used to play these songs to other artists, you know, Ray Charles and all sorts of bands. And a lot of them would just say, you know, they're just too personal. I can't imagine doing them. So it was put to Elton that he ought to be singing his own songs, which he hadn't thought about, you know. So that's when he was doing Empty Sky and developing his voice. And certainly when we did the Elton album, he's now definitely developing his singing. But the thing with Elton is, which marks him out really, and why everyone on the planet now knows that name, is because if he ever went for something, he'd go for it 100%, you know. And if he's now being asked to be the singer, he would do the best, the very best he could. And also, you know, because it's probably another question, is did he ever imagine, like you said, being a rock star, being a pop star? So it was then put to him that he's going to have to promote these albums. And that was when, because in the early days, he was really part of Hookfoot, you know, this band, and he'd be playing piano and doing a bit of a set. But now it was put to him that he really ought to be have his own band. And that was, I was there at the time when he formed this new band. And it was very, very different, very innovative, because it only had a bass player and a drummer, Dee Murray and Nigel Olsson. It was a three-piece band. And the prime reason for getting this band together was because he'd been offered to play at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. And to be honest, things weren't going well in the UK. He didn't really have a stage presence at all. He just used to come on and do his songs, you know, very laid back. But now he was offered to go to America, where his dreams are in America. And now he's playing in Los Angeles, you know, on Sunset Strip. So he really thought, this is the big one. I've got to be good. So he developed a set, which I was there at some of the rehearsals, and he'd start putting in some of this rock and roll medleys, you know, a whole lot of shaking, because he loves rock and roll. Everyone at that time, of course, those are the roots, you know. And as we know, or how Elton fans know, that when he played at the Troubadour, the place went berserk. You know, people like Bob Dylan, Neil Diamond were there, Leon Russell were there. They'd all come to see this guy who, to be honest, when they heard the Elton album, they thought he'd be very English, very sedate, sitting at the piano. And when he started doing all this rock and roll and kicking the stool away and jumping about, tambourine and all that, I found it a bit embarrassing. But anyway, the audience went for it. They just loved it.
I don't think you were at the Troubadour, were you? You were later.
No, I wasn't.
Yeah.
No, I know. I sort of sounded like I was there. But what it was Steve Brown was there. And so he used to ring up and he used to say, listen, it's because actually when he played the Troubadour, he also did some support gigs with Leon Russell, which probably not many people know about. And Steve used to ring up and say, do you know what? He's going down a storm here. He's going down better than Leon. You know, it's almost, he was saying it's a bit embarrassing. But that tour that I wasn't on, you're quite right, was the beginning of it, because American audiences were so totally different to UK audiences, and they just appreciated a guy up there having fun, putting his everything into these performances, you see, and they just loved him. And he loved them as well, more importantly.
When you listen to music and you're working so closely with someone, and you're becoming, you know, an engineer at the start and later a producer, do you listen to music differently? I mean, I write scripts, and when I watch a series or a film, it's made me sort of completely watch it differently. It's almost like I know what's coming, I know the structure, I know how things are going to develop too soon. So I just wondered if music becomes a different beast when you're working so closely with it.
Well, I guess it must do, you see. I guess I must listen to it differently, because, you see, what happened was probably Elton was the first person that I'd actually been in proximity to, and they're playing the piano and singing a song that I've never heard before in my life. And I'm thinking, and I'm getting tingles as well, you know, that I've never had before, because I loved it, you know, and it was setting off something in my brain almost. And it wasn't just Elton, you see, because we formed Rocket Records in in the mid 70s, and we were offered a band, you see, and they were called Queen. And we were offered them, and I used to play these tapes, and the same thing would happen, you know. I'd suddenly think, and there was lots of great bands around, but I actually thought this is special. And the same thing happened when I met Chris Rea. I just heard his early demos. The same thing happened when I heard Joan Armatrading, who you've probably heard of, but not everyone has. I heard her first demos because Gus Dudgeon was going to produce her. And the same thing happened. It's like you're just aware that this is something special, you know. And what I say is that this is when it was embryonic, you know, when they were just demos, not when they were finished productions, finished masters, which is also the case with Queen. They just produced this out, their first album, but it was a kind of demo album, really. So after that happened a few times, and then you realize that these artists go on to sell hundreds of millions, you know, you start to think, well, I must have a bit of a talent for that, you know. So I get sent lots of new artists, and but I empty my head or mind. I'm probably expecting it to not be very good, to be honest, because the chances of hearing something magnificent is rare, you know. So I'm probably thinking this isn't going to be very good. And then if it starts to build, even if it's only acoustic and voice or piano and voice, if there's some sort of bit of magic there, I immediately pick up on. And also, hopefully, as a producer now, I think of how I can make it into something, you know, that's not embryonic, something that moves on from that stage. But you're right, you know, it like you said, I've never thought about that, but I'm sure it's the same with an artist, you know, a painter, when they see a painting for the first time. You know, when you're focused in that area, you know, you view things differently than people that generally do. I suppose that's it.
How did you deal with the personalities? I mean, I've interviewed Elton, I think it's 8 or 10 times.
Wow.
And, you know, I have seen him once when I went on a video shoot where Elton was having a wobbler, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, he's infamous in a sense for this. But, you know, they're under a lot of pressure. Fame isn't easy to deal with. And in some way, I see that as understandable, but sometimes it can be difficult and you need a certain technique to deal with the personality. So how was it for you, particularly later on when you went on, you were looking after Elton in America, weren't you, on this tour?
Very good. Yeah, you know that.
And so you were in close confines.
Yeah.
With Elton. I believe you were keeping people out of the dressing room.
You're right.
So, you know, how do you deal with a big personality like that, who can, you know, sometimes change and have a period of anger?
Well, look, the thing is that Elton is a particular case. You know, he's a very particular individual. So how he would react and his personality and this sort of thing is not general. You know, it is very particular. And you're quite right. I actually went on tour with Elton, looking after him as his personal assistant when I was 18, turned up at the airport with Nigel and Dee and you know, as a 3-piece band. And we went to America for the first time. We were at Carnegie Hall. The thing is that we were all kind of new to it. And we all also loved it, you know, and we loved the audiences and we all got off on it. And generally, Elton was brilliant. You know, he's a true professional. You know, he wouldn't leave the stage unless everyone's up on their feet. And to see him doing this and to see the audience reaction overtook any of the, you know, the car's not ready or the hotel isn't brilliant and all this sort of thing. To be honest, though, we were actually very well looked after. We still had limousines and this sort of thing. But you're quite right. I mean, Elton got terrible temper. But him and I just used to get on. And the thing is that we're both Aries, actually, and I kind of know that sign very well. So I used to watch him, and if someone was annoying him, I almost used to see it developing in him. He used to start going red from here up. And I used to think, he's going to go in a minute. And he did. He used to explode like a volcano, you know. And I just used to sort of watch it happening. but then I'd have to deal with it, because afterwards I'd have to sort of make sure he was all right, you know, in the dressing room or back at the hotel. But generally, you know, he'd explode, get it out of his system, and then we'd have a good laugh about it.
Don't go away. There's more with Stuart Epps coming right up. But I just want to ask you to comment, like, subscribe. That's all. And don't forget, at the end of this interview, Stuart will be letting you know how you can contact him if you have some music and you're looking for a master producer.
And one thing I learned from that is not to keep your, you know, not to keep things actually inside. You know, it's better to let them out, even though it might upset a few people around you. But, you know, further than that, in the studio, I always say that a part of a record producer's job is like a psychologist, you know, because generally, especially if it's new artists, youngsters, they're very, very nervous. And part of it is you have to try and put people at their ease at the same time as you want them to perform. You know, it's a very individual thing. You know, it's why not everyone can do it, not just as a producer, but as an artist, because you have to be very artistic. And it can be that actually that makes you quite shy. At the same time, you're singing or you're playing the piano and you're putting yourself out there. You know, your heart is on your sleeve, as you say. So it takes a very individual personality to make an artist. You know, the musicianship is important, but I always say much more important is the temperament and the you know, the way they handle it, you know, the way they can put themselves out there and do their best, even if it means, you know, they might blow it and all this sort of thing.
There was a period, as I mentioned at the beginning, that there just seemed to be one album after another of these great songs, and it went on for a long, long time. How prolific, and how did you see that sort of prolificness when you were in close quarters with Elton? Was he constantly writing? I mean, obviously Bernie wrote the lyrics, but was he constantly writing the music or thinking of ideas? Or did he go into the studio and actually do it then?
Elton is a very individualistic person, musician and everything else. So he had a very specific way of doing it. And it's crazy, but he didn't sit around writing, not like Chris Rea, who might be in the loo or in the bathroom, whatever, and a music idea comes into his head. He's quickly got to record it on something. Elton didn't write songs other than when he was going to do an album. And what would happen is that Bernie would send him often a dozen lyrics, and then he'd sit down, often in the studio, which is crazy. No one really believes this, but it's absolutely true that when he was making the Yellow Brick Road album at the Chateau in France, he arrived there with just the lyrics, you know, and then several days before the studio actually we were going to start recording, he wrote the songs. I mean, no one quite believes that, and it's almost hard to believe myself, but it is absolutely true that he then put the lyric on the piano and start writing the song. And I've seen him do it anyway. I've seen him do it when we worked together on a duets album, and he was writing you had the lyric, wasn't one of Bernie's lyrics, it was another lyricist. And he literally, I was getting the drum sound and all the band was ready, and he said, "Oh, I better just write the song." And it was called Duets for One. And he just sat down and wrote the song.
I mean, you booked Chateau, I'm going to ruin it with my French attempt here, but Chateau de Hérouville.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, you booked that Chateau, and I think there are a number of albums done there, weren't they? Honky Chateau, of course.
Yeah, Honky Chateau. I can't
Don't Shoot
remember.
Me, I'm the Piano Player, I think was another one. And you mentioned Goodbye.
Yeah, we had a bit of a stint there. And the thing is that what was special about it was that, in fact, the reason we went there is because we heard the Stones had been recording in France. But what they'd actually done was they'd had a studio on wheels. I'm sure there's a term for it. what are they called?
A mobile studio.
A mobile studio, thank you. So they built a mobile studio, an amazing one, and then they just rent a chateau and they'd record, and they recorded several albums. They'd also been to this place, the Chateau. So Gus went over there with Steve Brown, and Gus really took a liking to the studio and the equipment in it, which was very important, MCI equipment. He loved it. And so he wanted to make this album there. And it was the first time where everyone, instead of just driving to London to Trident Studios, where everyone lived together, you know, residential studios, they were called. And this was the first time this had happened. And it was a completely different atmosphere. And yeah, there were parts of it where Elton's, you know, personality might come through because he, you know, someone might have upset him or something. But generally, it was an amazing atmosphere, an amazing experience for everyone, and great product came from it. But literally, that's where he would not only record the albums, but it would be where he would write. And I think when he was touring with Billy Joel, you know, they were discussing this, and it came out that Billy Joel is nothing like Elton. You know, he's always writing, he's always got ideas, he's always putting down demos. And it's a very distinctive thing with Elton, is he would only write to order, if you like, you know, in a very, I suppose, in a very session musician way, which is, of course, how he grew up. But you also need to be a bit of a genius to be able to do that. And what made it a little bit easier was Bernie Taupin's lyrics, of course, which weren't just poems, they were songs, you know, and when he would scan them, the idea of the song would come into his head. Is it a ballad? Is it a rock tune? And they, you know, we know that Bernie's lyrics are amazing, amazing lyrics. And of course that helped a lot, but still Elton John's a genius when it comes to songwriting.
When Elton started Rocket Records, where did you want to position Kiki D?
John Reid, who was now Elton's manager at this time, John Reid was head prior to that of Tamla Motown in the UK. And Kiki D was one of the first white artists to be signed to Tamla Motown. So he introduced Kiki to Elton and to Rocket, and now she was signed to Rocket. And the idea was really, it's a good question again, the idea really, because she wanted to be a little bit more than a covers artist. You see, she was singing Tamla songs and, you know, covers, and she had it in her to really sort of, I could say she had the music in her, but, you know, she had it in her to be an artist in her own right, and actually also to maybe be involved in songwriting. But the first album was produced by Elton John, and it was called, she had a single out called Loving and Free. And it was, I suppose, folk music really, but kind of almost rocky folk music. And it was really developing her as this new artist now on Rocket Records. Steve Brown was in charge, and then I helped put a band together. And just to carry on from that, we had this incredible thing happen, because Elton just said he was doing a tour of America. He's doing a big tour of America, a 3-month tour of America. And he wanted Kiki D and the band to support him on that tour. And so it was a great experience, because I went on that tour looking after Kiki and the band. And that was in 1974, you see. And it was an amazing tour. We had our own plane. And it was particularly amazing because we had John Lennon come and join us. You probably know about that, at Madison Square Gardens. He came on stage. So,
I mean, that concert was legendary, wasn't it? It was legendary for a number of reasons, but I've heard you tell the story, and it fascinated me because of John Lennon, who hadn't performed for a while, was very nervous.
Totally.
Yeah. Can you describe how he was and how that changed when he went onto stage?
I can describe it perfectly, because, you know, John came on the plane with us a couple of days before the gig, and I wasn't with them, but they went out to eat, and he was rehearsing with Elton a bit of what they were going to do. I just remember turning up at Madison Square, and I'm supposed to be looking after Kiki, but as soon as I saw John, and he was with a girlfriend, I just sort of latched on to him, and I just, because he didn't have any management with him. So I thought, I'll look after him. That's my job. And I was actually in the dressing room with him and this lady who we found out was called May Pang. And there were only the three of us in this dressing room. And this is prior to the gig. And actually, one of my stories is there was a knock on the door. And I opened the door gingerly because, you know, who's knocking on the John Lennon's dressing room door. And it was Yoko Ono. And that was a bit of a shock because I didn't know that they all knew each other. I just thought he's obviously with a woman he's not supposed to be. And he's been found out now. There's going to be, you know, maybe the concert's going to be cancelled. And I don't know. I shouldn't have opened the door. It's all down to me. It'll be my fault. Anyway, turns out they all knew each other. Anyway, I actually walked with John. Elton's already been on stage at Madison Square, going down a storm as usual. But I walked with John towards the stage. We were at the bottom of the stage, and he's nervous. I can't remember what he was saying, but you could just tell he was nervous. And I'm thinking, why is this guy nervous? He's one of the Beatles. It's going to go down. It's going to be amazing. You know, it's going to be amazing. But he was nervous. And just before he went up the stairs, he said, "Oh, here we go over the hill," you know, as if he's going up, as if he's going to war or something. You know, he's just bloody nervous. Anyway, he hits this, as he's going up the stairs, I run round. So I see the reaction. And as soon as he hits the stage and he's been announced, the place just erupts into the most ridiculous sound I've ever heard at any gig. And the way I describe is it went into white noise. You know, it just went beyond people shouting into this, you know, just this huge buzzing, shouting, white noise sound. And they launched into, I don't know what it was. I saw her standing there. I think it might have been. And the place just went mad. And of course, he's gone down a total storm. And, you know, after the gig, people are very, you know, just said it was just amazing. Probably the best gig. Elton says it was the best gig he'd ever performed, you know, with the best result, to be honest.
I mean, there was a period in America, and I've read this, and you know, you'll tell me whether it's true or not, where I think 3% of all record sales, it was in sort of about 73, 74, I presume, were Elton John records.
Well, one way or another, yeah, he sold a lot of records. And yeah, I mean, you know, they were amazing times, albums going straight to #1. These amazing tours, you know, that but it's down to the guy, you know, he would never let things lie. You know, if he thought the band could be better, he'd get a new band. If he thought the producer could be better, he'd get a new producer. You know, very unusual guy if we're only talking about Elton, that he would never, it's never standing still. He'd always be looking to improve. And I mean, in a way, it's almost, you could say it's not sad exactly, but you'd think someone, you know, they sell a couple of million records, they'd be happy to say, well, that's it, I've done that. In a way, you might say it's a bit sad that he was always needing to get it better. You know, he's always needing to make a better album and have a bigger audience. You know, nothing was ever, if you like, quite good enough. You know, I can get that better, I can get that better. But that's where I say that's what marks out these individualistic musicians and artists that make it so huge, you know, because they've got this in their personality. They don't stand still.
Yeah, they must have immense drive, otherwise they're not even going to get there in the first place. And I think
totally driven.
That's it. If you've got that immense drive, it doesn't, you know, really go away. Now, you mentioned that, you know, Elton would change the band if he wasn't happy and so on and so forth. What would he have done to you during the recording of A Single Man if that tape had run out?
You're very good. I was going to check with you if you checked me out, but you've really checked me out. Well, you know, when you see him, I mean, he never did it to me exactly, but when you've seen him lay into someone because they've forgotten his case or they've done something, you know, that's upset him, you know what's possible. You just pray it never happens to you, you know, but you absolutely know what he's capable of. So in the case of Song for Guy, which was supposed to be this quick demo that he was putting down, and me and Clive were in the control room, and he said it would only take 5 minutes, and he keeps making mistakes. And Elton really really doesn't like making mistakes, as you can imagine. Everything's got to be perfect in his world. His world's got to be perfect, not just the tape that he's making. Everything to do with him has got to be as he wants it, you know, and it's taken him 50, 60 years to get to that point now. So, you know, this was the first time that he got halfway through this song, and then I looked down this instrumental, and I looked down to see there's not much tape left, and it just didn't bear thinking about that. If the first time he got to the end, we had to tell him, or I had to tell him, I ran out of tape. So, you know, I was thinking we'd just have to run out the room and get on a plane or something and fly somewhere and pretend that one of us was ill or something. I don't know. Anyway, as luck would have it, or as, you know, how it went was that he finished the last chord of Song for Guy, dun, 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 and as the last chord ran out, the tape ran out, and we got it. And what makes it even more special is that song is now being probably played on the radio at this very moment somewhere in the world, you know, after, 45 years or something. You know, it became a very special recording anyway.
I mean, just the last thing about Elton. Elton had a difficult childhood, which, you know, came out in the movie. It's come out in his autobiography. He's talked very openly about it. And you just mentioned that he created, with his music and everything he wanted, was sort of perfection, a perfect world. Do you think that sort of was the compensation for his childhood?
Absolutely. 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 Because it's not only Elton, but other artists that I've worked with who have to keep on going, proving themselves, are usually having to prove themselves initially to someone. And often that's with one parent. And in Elton's case, it was his father, who wanted him to be a bank manager, stop putting these ideas of playing music out, so, it's got into him at a very early age that what he wants to do is the last thing his father wants him to do. And so the only way it's going to happen is if he proves himself to his father in particular, because his mother was always very, was into what he was doing, but his father was the thing. And so he just tried harder. These people just try harder. And it seems that even when they don't have to try harder and the father figure's not there anymore, that's still in there somewhere. And someone that I can tell you, because I knew him, he's not with us, unfortunately, he just passed away, very similar is Chris Rea, who grew up with quite a strict father. They had a cafe, Rea's Ice Cream, and his father was always making him work in the restaurant, stop looking out the window, stop dreaming about whatever you're dreaming about, Very similar, that Chris was completely, I actually think Chris Rea is more focused than Elton, and was determined, to show his dad, and then beyond that he's capable of succeeding in this business and this music that his father was dead against, completely against. I always say that this is why I'm not sitting here in my £100 million mansion, because I actually had quite a easy childhood. My dad was into everything I was doing. I didn't have to try so hard, and that's why I haven't become Elton John or Chris Rea or Queen, to be honest.
Yeah, or Brian Wilson. I mean, same thing with his father shouting out when
That's
he's
true.
a bum note
Right.
and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's so many examples of that. So I want to get on to you today, because you're open to working with artists. Anyone can get in touch with you. You've worked across so many genres, but when you work with someone who gets in touch with you, do you focus on you talked about them as a personality. Do you focus on that? Do you focus on their songs, on their sound, or do you focus, as it were, on the artist's identity? What do you focus on?
Well, I suppose on the introduction, it would tend to be the music first. So, you listen to the music. It might be that I haven't even seen what the artist looks like. I haven't seen them live. It might just be a tape, you know, like we used to hear coming down the radio. So it tends to be the music first. And then obviously you're hoping that there's, if it's a singer-songwriter, you're hoping that they do have a personality to go with it. But I would say that the music at that point is more important, because especially if it's a youngster. I mean, I'm working with a 14-year-old at the moment. You know, he's a great lad, and he hadn't written songs before, and he's just written a song, and I'm producing it, and he does have a great personality, you know. So, but that's a bonus, really, because, you know, at a young age, you can't say that a personality is developed. You might be able to see signs of it. The main sign being a willingness to make this happen. That's the main thing I look for, is a willingness to listen to someone who's done it a few times, because that's the only problem I have is if I work with a youngster and they go, well, I want this to be like this, and that's got to be like this, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and I say, well, you don't need me then. You obviously know. And one thing actually is important to pass on is that I have found with a lot of youngsters and new artists is that they want to be everything, you know. They want to be the singer, the songwriter, the guitarist, the pianist, the producer, the engineer. And as you know, and as we've been talking about, I come from a period where music was made with teams of people, and we used to call those bands. And unfortunately, where are the bands of today? You know, they just aren't the same. There isn't the same amount of bands that there used to be. And that's such a shame, because for an individual to be able to do everything is almost impossible, I would say. You know, you get a handful of artists that are able. I mean, Elton would never produce himself. He would never engineer himself. He wasn't interested. You know, and Jimi Hendrix wasn't interested in playing the piano. You know, he wanted to be the best guitarist on the planet, and he achieved it, you know. So I think that it's very important from an early age that artists and youngsters define what they think their best feature is, and then get that. And if you can't do that, get someone else to do that. You know, if you can't play the piano, or if you can't produce, get a producer in, you know, and to help. People need help. You know, you can't see the main problem is that we've all got this equipment now, you know, you can buy this equipment in a shop to record yourself and to make music. And it's highly developed, and you can get it to a certain point, but it's still quite difficult to make magic happen, which I've been very lucky to be involved in all this great music we're talking about, where actually magic has happened with personalities getting together, you know, to develop the music. There are people that can do it. Ed Sheeran, I just think he's the best thing that's come along, to be honest, youngster-wise. He's hardly a youngster now, but, you know, he's something else. And of course, there are great new artists, but I can't think of any bands, maybe you know. But if there's bands out there, I'm always interested to hear. I'm always looking for the next Led Zeppelin, you know, next Bad Company, the next Free, or the next Robbie Williams, or the next Oasis. You know, I'm always on the lookout, hoping.
What should an artist realistically, or a band realistically, expect to gain from working with you, do you think? What's the difference before and after?
Well, the thing is that a producer's job, as the way I see it, is to add to what's not there, you know, is to make happen something that's not there. And that could be all sorts of things. You know, I'm a songwriter myself. So when I hear a song, if the verse is in the wrong place, or the chorus isn't there, or the middle eight hasn't been written, or whatever it is, I would help with that. So it's putting together whatever's lacking within the artist, you know. And if it's a band, it could be just the sound. It could be picking the right songs. I mean, the crazy thing is that, you know, I'm called a record producer, but most youngsters don't really know what a record is. So I have to sort of do a bit of explaining. And I have to explain that it's not like a film producer. It's more like a film director, you know. And Elton described Gus Dudgeon as the captain of the ship, you know. He's the one that guides the artist. That's the plan, is that you help guide the artist. You don't tell them directly, that's wrong, do this. you just help to guide them in the right direction. And that's a producer's job, really.
I mean, what's interesting is whenever anyone starts out in a career, they orient themselves often to the big artists of the day before they develop their own sound and identity. So when someone comes to you, if they come to you with something that is similar to someone else at that time, are you looking to try and sort of develop their own identity out of that?
Well, I will often say, who do you listen to? Who do you like? And if it's a youngster, again, I probably haven't heard of who they're talking about. So I would go and research that, and because because like you absolutely quite rightly said, most youngsters like myself and people I work with, we loved music, and so we loved other artists, and they modeled themselves on those artists. And to a certain extent, and great extent, that's what youngsters still do. So I would say, who do you listen to? Who is it? And I'll go and listen to it, and I'll say, right, well, to get your sound, anything like that, we need to do this. And I would help to develop because what you're hoping, obviously, is that in developing this artist along the lines of the person they love or they like, will come their own identity, because obviously that's what's important, is finding their own identity, which, to be honest, these days is not easy, because we're talking about, music is so developed, people have been doing it so long that it's hard to find something different. Everything you might say has been done, but I must admit, all right, it's a while ago now, but the first time I heard Ed Sheeran, I just thought, yes, that's all been done in one way or another, but I've never heard it been put together quite as brilliantly as that. And I love it. I love his voice. You can say that the songs are reminiscent of the Beatles or this, that, and the other, but it's still fascinating that new artists come along, not very often, admittedly, but it sounds different. And that's what I'm always looking to make happen, is something different, I guess.
Yeah, okay, final question. Why is it important for you to develop new talent at this point in your life?
I suppose the bad answer is to pay the bills. But no, it's I'm sitting in this tiny studio that I've got now. I don't know if you can see a lot of it, but the crazy thing is I still get such a buzz out of it. And it's not easy sometimes, developing, and I do a lot of remixing actually these days, because we've got the internet now. So I work with artists I don't even meet, and bands send me, and from America, a lot of it is still from the States. They've done home recordings, you see. And like I'm saying, that the technology is there to make home recordings, but there's very often something missing that separates a home recording from what you could release and what's going to sound amazing on the radio or on the TV. So, I do a lot of mixing in this room, and I love it still. I get a serious buzz out of creating something certainly better than it might have been or better than it was. And of course, there's nothing also better than I've got my own label now, you see, Epps Records. So I can also take the new artists, develop their sound, produce them, engineer it, and then release it as well and promote it, because of all the experience I've got in that area with some of the artists we've been talking about.
Brilliant, Stuart. It's been brilliant talking to you. I'm going to put all the information below in the text below. So whoever's watching this and would like to get in touch with you, they've just got to look at the text. They'll be able to get in touch. Wonderful. Finally, I want to say as well, I want to thank you, because I think it's important to thank people who have had an impact on the creativity that has enriched our lives. And you have worked with so many immense artists who have had an impact, and personally on me through Elton, Led Zeppelin. I mean, there's so many others. It really is a great achievement. So Stuart Epps, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Obviously, you don't know that there's anyone listening out there. Obviously, you get an idea with the artists that have made it. So, but you just do what you can, and it's great when people thank you for it, and like you just have done. And I've enjoyed this interview immensely. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.